behind me, and
Friends, welcome to In the Movement. This is our monthly webinar series where we engage and elevate the work of people in the justice movement. My name is Sam Heath, and I work with Equal Justice USA, and we're a national nonprofit who do work around death penalty repeal, restorative justice, and community safety. And this is a space that we've held for a little over 2 years, again, to talk about what is happening within the justice movement and all of its parts and pieces. And so in this space, we work hard and hold to the idea that mass incarceration and the fact that we incarcerate at a rate that's unprecedented in this country compared to other countries and civilizations ever before. We look at mass incarceration not just as a problem to be solved, but it's a symptom of how we think about society and punishment. It's a fear-based response to us responding to harm or wanting to protect ourselves, which for those of us in this space that are Christians is really important, thinking about the command that's repeated most often in Scripture, which is do not fear. So today's topic, we're looking at death penalty advocacy, especially within the state of Oklahoma. I talked about this being kind of a case study within one state, and there are a lot of things that are unique to Oklahoma, and there are some things that are translatable to other states and places, and the federal death penalty as well. And so our guest today is Adam Luck. He's the former chair of the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board, and many other things. Adam, if you want to say a few words about who you are.
Yeah, well, hello, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to be here, and look forward to conversation and whatever questions you all have afterwards. But yeah, from Oklahoma, I've been involved in justice work here for the last 10 years or so, and excited to be here today to share with you all.
So we're recording this, as you saw, and anybody who's registered, you'll be sent a recording of this, both the video and the audio recording as well. Any links that we reference or links that we put in the chat, we'll capture all of that and send that in to you in an email either today or tomorrow, so you can just really sit back and listen. We'll make sure you get all that info. If you'd like, it'd be great for people to introduce themselves in the chat. Feel free to share your name, your location. If you're with an org or a group, it's great to see who's in the space when we do these. And then lastly, we'll also save some time at the end for a Q&A if people have some direct questions for Adam and things that we shared in this space. So at the bottom of your screen is the Q&A button, and you can click that and type in a question, and we'll come back to those at the end. So a lot of what we'll talk about within Oklahoma is recent. There's so many ups and downs when we look at the story of the death penalty within Oklahoma. There's some threads all the way through it, but there are these inflection points, and one is really coming up. So this Friday begins a series of 5 executions over the next 6 days, which is a lot that are compressed in this time. 13 people have been executed so far this year. Last year in 2023, it was 24 people. I believe it's 7 states that will be executing this year, and some that haven't for a long time, including South Carolina, which is the execution scheduled for this Friday. All of this is really poignant, again, as we think about Oklahoma, because Emmanuel Littlejohn is one of the individuals in Oklahoma who's scheduled to be executed on September 26th. So all of what we're saying is really developing and unfolding right now. There are lots of groups and there's lots of advocacy, both at a grassroots level, at a policy level, at the legislature. There's so much conversation around Oklahoma. So I want, whether you're in Oklahoma or not, I really want you to kind of peer behind the curtain and see what's happening, what does that look like, and hopefully take some of those lessons, if you're not in Oklahoma, into some of the other states. And Adam is a really good guide for that. So I gave a little bit of this, Adam, but let's start here. What is the state of the death penalty in Oklahoma? How would you talk about kind of how and what's going on right now?
Yeah, well, again, it's great to be with you all and excited to share and have this conversation. We are currently conducting executions, and we have been since 2021. And at that point, we had been in a moratorium since 2016. And so at that point, we had 2 executions that did not go as planned. Both of them, we realized in hindsight, had been conducted with the wrong drug. And so the Attorney General in the state of Oklahoma at the time requested that all pending execution dates be postponed indefinitely, and that request was granted by the Oklahoma State Supreme Court. And then we were going through a federal litigation process on execution protocols in Oklahoma, and we had a new governor, and all that kind of came to the head in the fall of 2021. And at that point, we had a attorney general who was appointed by the governor after our elected attorney general resigned. And even before the federal litigation concluded, he requested execution dates for 25 individuals, which was the most we had ever scheduled at one time. And it was at a pace of one a month. And this was in 2021. And so at that point, it's kind of gone back and forth. We've had cases that have made it all the way to the governor's desk from the Pardon and Parole Board. We've had several recommendations from the Pardon and Parole Board for clemency. Only one of those recommendations has been granted, and it wasn't in accordance with the recommendation from the Pardon and Parole Board, but it was granted. And so it's kind of back and forth right now. We've got a lot of cases pending. And as you mentioned, the case coming up on the 26th is still, I mean, it was a recommendation that made it to the governor's desk, and it's pending decision from him right now. So we're back in the thick of conducting executions in Oklahoma, which has brought up a lot of conversations about if we should be conducting executions at all, and if so, how they should be conducted, which, you know, for those of us that have had any proximity to the system, oftentimes we walk away with the conclusion that there is no right way to do it. And that's kind of how I ended up where I'm at right now. So that's kind of the state of the death penalty practice in Oklahoma right now.
Now, each state is different, but I believe, and tell me if this is right, in Oklahoma, the governor can't grant clemency unless it's recommended by the Pardon and Parole Board.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the states, not every state has a Pardon and Parole Board, but Oklahoma does. It's a 5-member body. 3 of those members are appointed by the current governor, and then 1 is appointed by the state Supreme Court, and 1 is appointed by the state Court of Criminal Appeals. And then you have to have 3 votes to get a clemency recommendation to the governor. And there's 2 parts to that. 1 is a recommendation for clemency. And if it is recommended clemency, then they have to recommend what the sentence is commuted to. And so that's it. The governor can't make that decision unless it gets a majority vote of the board. And then at that point, such a recommendation, the governor can still do whatever he or she would like to do with that recommendation.
You talked about there being some problems with the drugs, and that's unfortunately not common to just Oklahoma. That's with lethal injection been an issue in lots of other states, Alabama and many others. And also want to make sure people know, you know, both botched and failed executions happen. And the difference is a botched execution is one that just goes badly. It might take a long time, or it might be in an obviously torturous manner, like with Kenny Smith in January of this year within Alabama, but that person eventually dies. A failed execution is one where they attempt to execute the person, and for whatever reason, they aren't able to. And there's a history of those all across the states, and a lot of those relate to lethal injection. So another part of the story is in 2017, there was the Oklahoma Death Penalty Review Commission report, and I'll put the link for that in the chat and make sure that's emailed to others after. But can you talk about what that was and what that revealed, and what has that done in Oklahoma since 2017?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in 2014, we conducted an execution on Clayton Lockett, and it took over 40 minutes. And this gentleman, he actually died after the execution was called off of a heart attack. And the next year we conducted another execution on a gentleman named Charles Warner. And some of his final words were talking about how he had fire in his veins. And that evening we had actually scheduled 2 executions. The next gentleman was Richard Glossop. And it was, again, on the same evening. At this point, this was Richard Glossop's 7th execution date. He had eaten his 3rd last meal, and he was hours away from being executed when we realized that we had the wrong drug in the execution chamber. So, I mean, just, you know, and I know this is kind of preaching to the choir here, but for me, this is something that, as I talk to people in Oklahoma and we ask questions about, it's okay to believe in the death penalty. We don't have to get to that point yet. But you do have to talk about how you think the death penalty should be practiced and at what level of competency. And when we get into the details of what people believe is a competent execution, typically would include having the correct drugs in the room.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So for most people at this time, you know, put yourself in the situation of any elected official in the state of Oklahoma at the time, it was embarrassing. It
Yeah.
was unconscionable that we would not know we had the wrong drug in the room. And not only did we realize we had the wrong drug in the room that night, we realized we had already used the wrong drug on Charles Warner, which really just shocked the conscience of a lot of people at the time. Even if you believed in the death penalty, a lot of folks found themselves squarely in the position of, I may believe in the death penalty, but I don't believe in practicing it like this.
Right.
So I think what we saw was really, for a lot of folks, the first crack in that belief of we are competent and I believe in the government's ability to kill its citizens. You know, and for a lot of us, we would say that that might be the most, if not one of the most important decisions a government can make, is about whether or not one of its citizens should live or die. At that point, I mentioned earlier, the state attorney general requested that all pending executions be postponed, which they did. They granted that. And then the governor created a bipartisan commission. And this is what you asked. It's the Death Penalty Review Commission. It was co-chaired by a former Democratic governor and a very well-known Republican federal judge. And it was bipartisan, included representatives from all stakeholders involved in the death penalty process. And it lasted a year and a half. They interviewed people, they researched, they called in expert witnesses, and went through every single stage of the capital punishment system in Oklahoma, came out with 47 different recommendations. And their number one recommendation was the moratorium should last indefinitely until a majority of these changes are made. That was their number one concern. Do not start executions again in the state of Oklahoma until these changes are made. And so you could, you know, Sam, I think you just put the link in there, but
yeah,
it's a pretty lengthy report, but the executive summary I think is pretty eye-opening, and it was at the time. You know, a lot of people, again, you know, if you didn't have proximity to it, you really didn't know. But for a lot of folks,
right,
first time really coming under the weight of just how many issues were at the time and how Oklahoma practiced capital punishment.
Yeah. Yeah. It kicked off a discussion, and you referenced that it really opened people's eyes, including some people within the state legislature, including Republicans who would say things like, I believe in God, guns, and the death penalty, but the way that we're doing it, and there's some of the fiercest opponents of it now, calling for a moratorium and saying that the way that we're doing this, which we knew 2017 and before, and certainly have since then, the way that it's happening is, as you said, unconscionable.
Yeah.
So someone asked in the chat about whether or not the governor is bound to the decision of the Pardon and Parole Board on clemency. And we know that he's not, that we know that he has ignored that in the past, this current governor, that that's happened in the past as well. It is just that, a recommendation that can be followed or not. But you talked about and referenced there was one time recently where that recommendation was followed. What was that case and how did that go?
Yeah, and I'll give a little bit of background by way of answering that. So I grew up in Oklahoma. I was in the military for 5 years and then finished college and graduate school and came back to the state of Oklahoma in 2014 between my first and second year of graduate school, and worked for the governor at the time, Mary Fallin, and did kind of an update to what was happening in Oklahoma's justice system. So if you don't know, at the time, we had the highest female incarceration rate in the world, second highest male incarceration rate. We're still top 5. And they were really trying to figure out what some next steps might look like. And so I spent the summer, you know, went to a prison for the first time, talked with people who were working in corrections involved in, this was 2014. So that first execution that did not go well had just happened. And so that was a big topic of conversation. And so you know, spent several months just kind of diving deep into that, and then moved back to Oklahoma the next summer in 2015 and worked with the governor's office to implement a lot of the changes that we had recommended. And then shortly after that, she appointed me to the State Board of Corrections, where I served from 2016 to 2019. So I went to every prison in the state and just got even deeper into what was happening in our justice system in Oklahoma. And then through that, met who is our current governor, Kevin Stitt, as he began his campaign in 2017. And then he asked me to serve on his public safety transition team, which I did, and then appointed me to the State Pardon and Parole Board in 2019. And I served there for 3 years. My final year was as chairman of the Pardon and Parole Board. And so at the time when I was appointed in 2019, this was still, we were still in a moratorium. We hadn't conducted an execution in over 3 years. The federal litigation looked like it was going to continue on for, likely several more years as we figured out what our execution protocols were going to be and how we could even attain these drugs. And so we were all very surprised in the fall of 2021 when the appointed Attorney General requested those 25 execution dates. We were going to be executing people with protocols that were still under federal litigation for whether or not they were constitutional. And the first 7 people that we scheduled were excluded as parties to that litigation because they failed to check a box identifying their preferred method of alternative execution. And they didn't check that box because for religious reasons, they did not believe they had the ability to participate in their own death. And so they didn't check that box.
And just to make sure people know kind of what that is, this is a huge and a sad point. Alabama does this as well. You are asked to state the execution method that you want. Some states have more than one execution method, and you're given the chance to say what that is. Of the 5 that we have within this nation, most states have more than one. And so some people on death row have to choose, but these 7 individuals you said didn't.
Yeah, they didn't. And so they were the ones excluded from that litigation, and those were the first executions that were scheduled. And I participated in 5 clemency hearings. So in the state of Oklahoma, the Pardon and Parole Board is tasked with reviewing the case one final time before their execution date. It is constitutionally required that that hearing happen 21 days before their execution date. And at the time, no one on the Pardon and Parole Board had ever participated in a clemency hearing. Because we hadn't done one. And at that point, it was over 5 years. And so we all, in Oklahoma, the Pardon and Parole Board is part-time. So I had a full-time job as the CEO of a nonprofit here in Oklahoma City, which I was in that role from 2017 until actually just this month. And so I had a full-time job, and the Pardon and Parole Board in Oklahoma met every single month. And we would review over 1,000 cases a month for pardons, commutations, and parole. And just to give you some context, that meeting took me 30 or 40 hours to prepare, to get ready for it. And then it would usually last Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and sometimes Thursday of an entire week. And it's basically, it's from 9 to 5, with a small break for lunch. And you're just going case after case after case after case. A clemency hearing was in addition to those meetings. Clemency hearing took me about the same time, honestly, to prepare for making that decision, about 30 hours. And the clemency hearing was a full day hearing. So you would hear from the Attorney General's office, which represented the prosecution. You would hear from their attorneys, the defense. And then the Pardon and Parole Board would hear from the individual. And they would speak last. And this was their final opportunity to ask for mercy. And then we would vote, at the end of this 5 or 6 hour hearing. They would call each of our names, and we would have to say yes or no. And if we said yes, what we recommended commuting the sentence to. And then we would be done, and the board members would get up and leave first and leave the parking lot, and then they would dismiss everybody else because they didn't want us interacting with anybody that was there. And then that recommendation would go to the governor's desk, and that governor had all the way up until the execution happened to make that decision. There was no time constraints on when that happened. So, you can imagine we were all, I'll just speak for myself, just feeling very anxious about what that was going to look like. I went from a position that obviously I was taking very seriously, but it's different when you are voting on the life of another human being. Voting on a person's freedom is no light task either, but the weight of deciding whether or not a human being should live is different. And when I made the commitment to serve on the Pardon and Parole Board, that was not even part of the conversation. Nobody thought executions were going to be happening anytime soon. And so we didn't even really talk about it. And when I joined the board, I don't know that I would have said or really been able to articulate exactly how I felt about the death penalty. I think like many of us, I walked into it having some general ideas about how I felt, but those beliefs were never tested under the weight of actually making that decision for myself. And this guided one of the conclusions I came to after this experience, which is that if people really did have to sit under the weight of making this decision for themselves on behalf of their community, I think 9 out of 10 people would change their mind because they would probably go through a similar process that I did, which is if I'm going to make a decision about this case, there are first things I have to consider about the system that got this person to this point to begin with. And again, I'm sure a lot of us have gone through that process just by virtue of the fact that you're on this call. But for me, it was the first time that I ever really had. And I started to ask questions about how this system functions and is it truly fair? And this kind of gets into the questions that I started to ask myself, which was, you know, in Oklahoma at the time, we had 10 exonerations, I think it was at the time. And, you know, that was about a 12% error rate in the state. Tracked with, you know, nationally, you look at the number of exonerations we've had is right around 12% as well. And I know that there are those that would say that those numbers aren't apples to apples, you know, that there's some nuance there. And I totally understand that. But the reality is we don't get it right every time.
Right.
And that was really the first time that I had to sit with and think about, okay, if we don't get it right every time, how many innocent people am I okay with executing to continue capital punishment? So what error rate am I okay with? And, you know, at the time I thought, okay, well, maybe I could pick a number. Maybe I could say I'm okay with how things are. So let's just say 1 in 10. I just my personality and the way that I think, you know, I kind of would have to go to this next layer of questions about like, okay, well, if I'm okay with 1 in 10, then am I okay with knowing who that 1 in 10 is? So am I okay with being able to put a name to that face? Can you all still hear me?
Yep, you're good.
Or a name to that statistic, you know, in other words, like, can we transition from numbers to people? And proximity is what allows us to do that. So then I thought, okay, well, I don't know that I am, you know, I don't know that I am okay with knowing who that 1 in 10 is, but even if I am I okay? You have to go to the next question. Like, am I okay with that being my family member or my friend? And then ultimately I got to this conclusion that was like, if I really do believe in the death penalty, I have to pick an error rate. And if I am able to pick an error rate, I have to be willing to be a part of that error rate. So if it's 1 in 10, am I willing to be that 1 in 10? Am I willing to be the sacrifice to make this system continue to function? So if I'm not, then we have to kind of back up to those layers and realize like one of the core legs that's holding up this stool of support for the death penalty actually doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
And will actually come down.
Right.
You know, that was kind of one of the main questions for me. And then of course, you know, there's lots of other things that you can dive into too, like the fiscal impact of the death penalty. And, you know, like what you and I, Sam, have talked about a lot, which is just that what is the death penalty truly accomplishing, you know? And as a person who is a part of the Christian faith tradition, this was another big question for me. It was like, if this was a decision that Jesus was making, what would his decision be? And, you know, it sounds trite, and honestly, it even felt trite at the time. You know, you're sitting here beside this and really diving into this for the first time and asking the question like, okay, God, like, help me understand what you would do. So I go to, you know, and as I would with any major decision in my life, you know, I pray about it. I ask people in my life for their input and their advice. And I go to scripture with this new lens of what did Jesus do? If this is the faith practice and tradition that I'm a part of, and this is the person that I follow, okay, well, what was his response to these things? and I read scripture differently, and I saw things that I hadn't really seen before, and I understood things in ways that I hadn't really understood before. And I get that people can even read the same text and come to
Mhm.
different, so I leave room for that completely. My personal experience that I was affected by what I read and saw in the life and teachings of Jesus in a way that I hadn't been before. And so those were some of the foundational questions that I was really wrestling with. And then
Mhm.
what was interesting to me is, the very first case that we reviewed was Mr. Jones, and all four of the subsequent cases after that also had individually reasons why I voted for clemency. And ultimately, in all five cases, I voted for clemency. And so, that was just the conclusions that I had come to broadly, but then case by case, I also came to that same conclusion for different reasons
Mhm.
that I just couldn't do it.
Mhm.
And so after the third clemency hearing, we had recommended 2 out of the 3 to the governor's desk. One, he did commute, but we recommended that the sentence be commuted to life with the possibility of parole, and it was commuted to life without the possibility of parole. And the next one was denied. And then we were asked to come meet with the governor, and it was over the Thanksgiving break, and so I wasn't able to. In the fourth clemency hearing, I was the only vote for clemency. And so I kind of had a sense of like what that conversation must have been like. Not to say anything about my fellow board members or what that conversation was, but it just stuck out to me. And then
Mhm.
clemency hearing, it was on a morning, and my meeting with the governor was that afternoon, and it was the same thing. I was the only vote for clemency that 5th time, and I went and met with the governor and his general counsel, and we just had a conversation about it. And he just asked me why I was voting the way that I was, and I explained why I had come to the conclusions that I had, again, broadly, but then case by case. And he explained why he felt like the death penalty was okay, um, and ultimately, he said, "I'll give you some time to think about it." And I said, "I have thought about it, but if you feel like my position on this negates my contribution as a member and chairman of the board, then you can ask me to resign, and I will." And about a month later, he did. And so I resigned, and my initial resignation letter didn't say anything about the death penalty, and they asked me to include that in my resignation letter, so I did. And I just exited with as much grace and honoring him as much as I could in that situation. And I didn't talk about it for over a year.
Mhm. Mhm.
During that whole time, which is a whole nother thing we don't have to go into, but the district attorneys in Oklahoma engaged in a 3-year coordinated and concerted effort to remove myself and another board member from the board, because we were appointed under a new law in 2018 that got passed that required 2 board members to have experience in mental health care and social services. I had background and experience, obviously, in corrections as well, but that was one of the statutes that I was appointed under. And I mean, their efforts to remove us from the board went all the way up to the Oklahoma State Supreme Court, led to a multi-county grand jury investigation. When that did not move forward, it led to the county grand jury, which had not been formed since the Oklahoma City bombing in 1996. And I mean, those cases literally just wrapped up like last year. I
Yeah.
mean, it
Yeah.
was a long-term concerted effort to get us off of the board. And so, I didn't say anything for a long time, and just, I mean, Sam, we just spent time thinking through that experience and processing that experience, but I knew right away that I needed to share that with people, not publicly, but just one-on-one in ways that
Mhm.
felt like would be most meaningful to help change people's hearts and minds. And
Mhm.
that's part of the work that I've been doing over the last 2 years. And maybe we can kind of transition to some things that have been going on the last couple of years, but that's kind of where I'm at right now, is taking this experience, because people can disagree. Absolutely. I mean, there's still room to disagree, but the experience that I've had, one of, not many people who've actually had to sit in that seat and make that decision, it's
Mhm.
hard to dismiss. And I think the way that we've gone about talking with people in Oklahoma has kept that door open. And with grace, we meet with people and just say, would you consider this? Have you considered this? Would you think of,
Mhm.
and here's why I thought about it, and here's
Yeah.
how my mind changed. And maybe this is something that you're wrestling with too, but don't really have the room to say, but you can say it here, and I'm happy to talk with you about it. And so those are the kinds of conversations that we're having right now, and the work that we're doing, and I believe we'll continue to do until the death penalty is not practiced in Oklahoma.
Hmm. I've heard you say in other spaces something to the effect of a lot of those questions that you thought through of what number am I willing to essentially sacrifice, and knowing that some of these individuals are innocent. And you said something like, if your number is greater than zero, you've got to be against the death penalty.
Yeah.
And we know that that number is greater than zero, not just within Oklahoma with at least 10 exonerations, but nationally. And Witness to Innocence reported this summer the 200th exoneration that we've had in the modern era of the death penalty, or since executions have resumed since 1977. And so we know that we've almost executed innocent people. We know we've executed innocent people, and there have been incredibly close moments. And you've talked about Julius Jones and his case, and his family and many around him advocate for and speak about him being innocent. And his execution, it came within 4 hours, and then he was brought off death row, but yet still remains in prison. But to your point, with the sentence of with no possibility of parole. So that was a major moment, I think, internationally, because there was so much attention in and on Julius Jones. And there have been other moments since then, but things continue to develop there. And from what you're sharing, Oklahoma's gone to great lengths to maintain the death penalty, and that they've wanted to have it. So where does that go in the past couple years? What have things looked like? And I'd also love for you to share about the poll that came out, and I think it was it 2022, and some of the shocking numbers as we've learned what people actually think and feel within Oklahoma about the death penalty.
Yeah, so like I said, we've had several major cases come up. The other one that came up was Richard Glossop's case, where our next elected attorney general, after the appointed attorney general lost, they ran against each other, and this other gentleman won, Gentner Drummond. He requested an independent investigation of Richard Glossop's case, came to the conclusion that he could not support the state's case against Richard Glossop. But he had no avenue to not pursue it. So he had to petition all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and it's pending right now, which is unprecedented for. I mean, if the Supreme Court denies this, it'll be the first time that a state has ever executed somebody when the state did not want to do it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's how backwards things are in Oklahoma. The attorney general is saying, "Please don't make me do this."
Mm-hmm.
He has no choice. So that kind of happened leading up to 2022. One of the legislators in the state of Oklahoma, the state of House of Representatives, was made aware of Richard Glossop's case, and through that, his eyes opened to some of the issues with capital punishment in Oklahoma. And he was one of those people that said, "I believe in capital punishment, but not like this. If it's this hard to get somebody who is innocent off of death row, we shouldn't be doing it." And requested an interim study, which in Oklahoma is the way the legislature receives public testimony on pending legislation. So they don't do that during the session, they do it in the fall before. So in the fall of last year, we did a interim study on capital punishment and a moratorium. And we had several speakers come. I mentioned Andy Lester, who was the co-chair of the Death Penalty Review Commission. He came and spoke. We had the longest serving Department of Corrections director in the history of the state come. And I met with him a few times leading up to it. And I asked him if he would be comfortable, because I knew him, and we hadn't talked in a long time, but I reached out to him and we got coffee, and I told him what we were planning, and I told him where I was, and we found ourselves agreeing on a lot of the same things. And I just asked him, I just said, "Justin, would you come and testify at this hearing?" And he said, "Adam, I haven't been in that building since I resigned in 2011. And he was in that role for a long time. He oversaw more executions than any other State Department of Corrections director, 28 executions.
Wow.
And he said, in his experience, it showed him the issues with capital punishment. And so he came to this hearing in the fall, and he said, it is not a matter of if Oklahoma will botch another execution, it's a matter of when. And he talked about his experience and what it was like being the person responsible for it. And again, an experience that you may still disagree with. I would find it hard to believe if you did after hearing from somebody who actually did that, but you cannot dismiss it.
Right.
And we introduced legislation in the spring of this year to institute a moratorium, and we were able to successfully get it into a committee where the legislation would be heard. So again, in Oklahoma, and this is where you get into the nuances state by state legislative processes, but in the state of Oklahoma, the chair of the committee does not have to hear every single bill that's introduced by its committee members. The chair has complete discretion on what bills are heard. So we were able to get it into a committee that we thought would be favorable. We were able to get the bill heard, and we were able to get it passed out of committee unanimously. And we met with each one of those legislators, and it wasn't in a public setting. It was in their office behind a closed door, asking them questions, and them ending with saying things like, you know, I've never thought about it that way before. Thank you for taking the time to explain it. Thank you for not arguing me into a corner. Thank you for giving me room to say I may be in an in-between space. And that, I think, was probably the most successful part of our strategy so far, is not making people choose between black and white. And say, just the fact that you're in a gray area, let's just celebrate that you're not on that end of the spectrum anymore.
Right.
And this is such an important issue that as soon as you step into that gray area, it means we need to pause.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that made it out of committee, which, you know, in the Oklahoma legislature, it's a 2-year session. So we'll be able to start that process up again. We've got a legislator in the Senate that is going to help us run that same legislation. And so we're having those conversations right now. We just, we've got another interim study coming up on October 3rd on felony murder. We have 2 people right now on death row that did not actually even commit the murder that was alleged. And so, you know, this would directly impact them. And so that's another conversation that we're having right now. We created a letter called Christ in Capital Punishment that we use to, again, create a landing spot for people who were a part of the Christian faith practice and had discomfort about capital punishment, but didn't know how to express it. And a lot of us at the time, you know, this was 2 years ago, we just needed a tool to go have conversations with people. And so we, a group of us wrote this letter and just asked people to start signing it. And so we did, and we still use this today to have conversations with people in Oklahoma about their faith and how it ties into or does not tie into capital punishment. So there's been a lot of activity in Oklahoma, and there continues to be. The 8th Amendment Project has been super helpful over the last 2 years, getting a group of everybody working on this on a monthly meeting. And we've met annually all together in person as well, which has been great. And you just see there's just growing support for opposition to the death penalty and moratorium. So you mentioned the polling. We did a poll in the fall of 2022 and showed over 70%, you know, and this was by the top Republican strategist and polling firm in Oklahoma. And again, this gets a little bit into the weeds of strategy and how you have these conversations, but we knew if we go run this poll and it's done by anybody other than this firm, it will immediately be dismissed. And so we asked them to do it. And what it showed was, when given an alternative, over 70% of the state of Oklahoma is going to be supportive of a moratorium.
Yeah.
And again, that leaves room for people to say, I still believe in the death penalty. Okay, that you know, I may disagree with you, but that's not really the point right now. The point is, do you think we should be conducting executions? And over 70% of people said no. And then we also asked, where does this rank in your top 10 issues? And it was like less than 10% of people said it was in their top 10 issues. And so what we wanted to do is take this to legislators and say, this is not going to be a part of your campaign. This is not going to represent something that's going to cost you. And actually, in fact, it's going to represent you exercising true leadership, which we would define as leading a group of people towards making a decision on a difficult problem. That's you know, what we would want to believe is why you're here. You're here to exercise formal authority and leadership in the state of Oklahoma as you represent your constituents. And this is an issue they need help on. And this is an opportunity for you to say, I have dove deep into this, I've considered this, and I don't think we should be doing this. And so we wanted to say, like, not only do people support an alternative or support a moratorium when given an alternative, but they also aren't, they're not going to care even if you do go outside
Right.
of what they believe. It's going to be okay. And so we've used that as well in conversations with legislators, maybe in an election year, or, you know, may have other political considerations that they're calculating at the time. And so anyway, you know, all that to say, there's a lot going on, and I'm excited to see the progress and working to continue that momentum.
I put in the chat the 2022 poll that Conservatives Concerned put out. So there's a national group, Conservatives Concerned, and then within Oklahoma, that branch, Conservatives Concerned about the death penalty. They're the numbers. 78% of individuals in Oklahoma would support a moratorium, and so many other things that were maybe shocking, but maybe not. You know, to your point, you felt that this was where things were already, and this poll by this group really helped to validate that. So there's a couple questions that people had on things that you mentioned with the board, and for everybody listening and watching, remember you can put in any questions in the Q&A. But how long does someone sit on the board? And then right now with the 5 members that are on the board, Adam, what are their general backgrounds? Because there's a theme and a thread there for the board right now.
Yeah, so each member that is appointed by the governor serves coterminous, so they serve a 4-year term. If they get appointed midway through a governor's term, then their term ends when the governor's term ends. If that governor is reelected in the state of Oklahoma, you can run for 2 4-year terms. Then the governor has the opportunity to reappoint or not when they're reelected. So those positions typically turn over. They've turned over quite a bit. I've lost count at this point. The last time I counted, we had 12 board members in 4 years, I believe was the number. A tremendous amount of turnover.
Yeah.
The board members that are appointed by the state Supreme Court and the Court of Criminal Appeals are staggered with the governor's appointments, and yeah, so I think they start in the 2 years after that. So anyway, that's how they're appointed. And traditionally, the board has been composed of people with law enforcement backgrounds. That you know, myself and Kelly represented the first 2 people who really didn't have that as part of their background. So think former police officers, former judges, former district attorneys. This is maybe a little bit down in the weeds, but some important context in Oklahoma is we passed major drug possession law reform in 2018 that made drug possession a misdemeanor instead of a felony. And so we had at the time thousands and thousands of people who were in Oklahoma prisons that if they had committed that crime today wouldn't be there. And so for the first time really ever, the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board began to utilize their commutation authority, which allowed us to change someone's sentence. And there were a couple criteria that allowed us to do that. So one of them was if a law had changed that made the sentence appear excessive. And so one, the composition of the board traditionally was law enforcement. And so district attorneys were okay with people who agreed with them, even if they did exercise that authority. I mean, before 2018, I think, you know, it was very uncommon to see more than 50 of those cases a year to even be considered. And less than half of those, I'm trying to be conservative, I think it was even less than that, would ever even make it to the governor's desk. And, you know, when there was a law that was passed that made that reform law retroactive, and it required the Pardon and Parole Board to come up with a system to make these decisions. So we didn't even initiate it. It was the state legislature that said, Pardon and Parole Board, you figure out who committed these crimes under this old law and how to get them out of prison. They required us to do that, which led to the largest single-day commutation in the history of the United States. And the district attorneys did not like that the Pardon and Parole Board composition had changed, that had backgrounds that were different from theirs, and agreed with them. And they did not like that we were exercising our constitutional authority to adjust sentences of people who the law had changed, and it was now unjust. And the current composition, I think, as often happens in situations like this, has probably swung, the pendulum has moved back the other direction. So I believe all 5 members have some tie to law enforcement at this point. I don't, but I think 2, maybe 3 of them are former judges. But even then, you know, the case that's pending the governor's decision right now was a majority vote of the board
Right.
for clemency.
Right.
And that has happened several times since, you know, in the last 2 years, even with the composition changing, which is incredible in and of itself, that even with people on the board now who saw what happened to me and saw what happened to other board members who were voting for clemency, even with that, they're still coming on and saying, no, there's an issue here. I don't think this person should be executed. So even with the change in the composition, we're still seeing opposition to the death penalty, or at least enough discomfort to get board members to say, I don't think we should execute this person.
I want to go back to the Christ and capital punishment letter. I put that in the chat again, and I'll email that out to people. That's been hundreds of people that have signed that since it came out. It's also a living document. People can add their name to it. It's people all over the state of Oklahoma, and it speaks practically and theologically against the death penalty. But it ends with a call for restorative justice. So why does it end with that? I mean, that was intentional. It could have just been, this is the death penalty, this is terrible, let's speak against it. But it gives a way forward. Why does it do that, and why is it restorative justice?
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, we've talked about this, Sam, and you've been really helpful for me just thinking through the idea that it's not enough to just take something away. You have to replace it with something else.
Yeah.
And I think for people in Oklahoma who are raised with the belief that capital punishment is biblical, that it is in accordance with their faith practice, they need something more than just, let's take that away. Now, we have to tie deeper into what are, I would say, root beliefs of the Christian faith practice, which is the opportunity for restoration, the opportunity for what we would all hope would happen. What we all hope is happening with this is justice. What does justice mean? And for a lot of people, they just don't really know how to describe that, or if they can describe it, it's not consistent with what they say they believe based on their faith practice. So what we try to get to is like, well, justice is really wholeness. And what we hope our justice system is doing is creating a path back to wholeness for the person with themselves, with their community and the parties that were harmed, if there was harm caused, and with God. What does that path back to wholeness look like? And what we see is that capital punishment ends that path. There is, and again, I, you know, just being careful to acknowledge that I am not a victim of violent crime, and I don't want to speak from that perspective at all. Sam, you and I both have talked with people who are, and we've had people come regularly speak who are and have been victims of violent crime that express they didn't feel that connection and that path back to wholeness through the capital punishment system. So we try to reference that instead of giving the sense that that's something that we've experienced, but just want to acknowledge that. But you know, that what we hear over and over again is that that's not a path back to wholeness. And so that's part of why we try to incorporate that into the letter, is to tie back to what we would hope is a common denominator, that whatever the system we create as a society to make these decisions would bring about justice and would bring about and facilitate a path back to wholeness for this person with themselves, with the person that was harmed, if there was harm, and with God. And what we would say is capital punishment does not do that.
Yeah. And for so long, the national narrative was justice equal punishment, and that murder victim family members and district attorneys and judges were speaking of justice in terms of retribution or the death penalty. And that narrative has started to change as more and more murder victims' family members have been given voice and been able to make their wishes and desires known. And groups like Journey to Hope carry these stories forward. And we've heard both from murder victim family members before an execution say, actually, I don't want this to happen. I don't think this will lead to healing for anybody. We've also heard from people who have gone through that execution say, I did not experience this healing. And so the truth of what the narrative actually is has started to come out more and more, rather than it being very controlled, especially by the criminal legal system, of saying this is the only form that justice can take. But you use that term wholeness, which is such a great way of speaking about what justice actually is. And has that connotation of everybody getting what it is that they need, right? The criminal legal system most often asks a question, what law was broken and what punishment do we need to bring? But restorative justice and wholeness, and Christianity especially, asks who was harmed and what does healing look like for all parties involved. And that doesn't mean that accountability is off the table. It really depends on how we define accountability. You know, do we force accountability on someone, or do we make space for that person to be able to, if they can, make some form of restitution, because the death penalty cuts that off. I've heard others say, I think it was Shane Claiborne who said a version of, the death penalty is our ultimate no to a belief that God can change someone or bring healing out of a horrible or horrific situation. It cuts that off. So I love that the Christ and capital punishment statement ends with, here's a way forward. Here's a hopeful way forward. We've seen it work and bring healing and beauty, and we want that to happen more and more often.
Yeah.
So what does it look like especially for churches, to respond to these things? What would you want individuals of faith, and especially churches, to do in response to all of these things that they've heard?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, my personal experience here has been just starting with people that I know and asking them to read that letter. I just would send it to them. And chances are, if I feel comfortable enough to send them that letter, they know me enough to know that this is a part of what I've been doing the last, several years. And so they probably have an idea of why I'm sending it. But if not, I just say, I would love to talk to you about this. Would you read this? And can we get coffee and talk about it? And I have found that more often than not, that's the first time anybody's ever really asked them to consider their belief on the death penalty. And done it. And even if they have, oftentimes it's been asked in a context where they feel challenged.
Yeah.
And again, you and I have talked a lot about, like, I've never changed my mind when somebody argued with me. It's typically, maybe afterwards, maybe I've thought about it and come to some conclusion that differed than the position that I had, and I can come back around. But more often than not, the fact that it's an argument solidifies my position, for better or for worse. Maybe that's just my personality.
Yeah, no, that's real, right? In group bias, it reinforces it. Absolutely.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
so
an argument or a debate really isn't the way into someone's heart. Doesn't mean it's wrong, but it's
right.
not really gonna win someone to something new.
Exactly. And I just reflected on my own experience. What changed my heart and mind? It wasn't because somebody said, all right, I'm going to have you read this book and watch this documentary and talk to this person, and by the end of it, you're going to give your life to ending this practice in Oklahoma. Nobody said that. I had proximity to it. I had to wrestle with it myself. And yes, I went and found people who were farther down that path than I was that I could talk to, and I did my own research and I thought about these things, but ultimately it was just me wrestling with it. So really the way I view it is being a partner on this journey with people, and they may not have even started it yet. So really, if they haven't started it, that's my goal, is just say, will you think about this? So I think it's different when you go individual, one-on-one. That's how I have had that conversation. In a congregational setting, I mean, Sam, you've got a ton of resources for how to have those conversations in small groups, in classes. And again, it's not, I think removing the political stigma around talking about it, and in a state like Oklahoma, realizing that it is happening all around us. And you may be at a church or a part of a faith practice that isn't comfortable talking about it from the stage, but if you're a member of a church or a faith practice, chances are that leadership team is going to be open to hearing something from one of their parishioners. And that's the approach that I've taken, and that I encourage others to take, is just start there. Have that conversation with your own church. And then more broadly, outside of just one congregation, we've tried to create times and places for people in Oklahoma who are a part of a faith practice to come and talk and hear more, in a way that they're not going to be argued into a corner. They're going to be asked really specific questions about their beliefs, and then given resources to explore those questions further. And the most important resource they're going to get is a relationship with me or one of the other people that's there. And that we know the speed of this change is going to move at the speed of relationship. And we know that that's how this is going to happen. So that's my hope, and that's kind of been our approach here in Oklahoma, is to do it that way. The Faith Coalition call that you hosted this morning is a great example of that. That's a call that didn't exist last month, you know, and it's part of the work partnering with EJUSA and the Eighth Amendment Project, getting the group of us together in Oklahoma to talk about what our strategy is and where we want to go. And, I think that has been really fruitful so far.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so many different ways that this work can look. And I like that you're saying begin with, how did you get to this place? Often the best conversations with people aren't what is your view of the death penalty, but how did you get there? And that's a different story for so many people. And very often my conversations with people about the death penalty end with someone saying, Sam, that's the longest conversation I've ever had with anyone about the death penalty. And I think that's true for most people, that that's something that they often don't have proximity to. And therefore they've not had to really think through, in light of all the things that you shared, what would they think or do given that revelation of all of these things that we know.
Yeah.
And what is it that brings that? And you said it's a relationship.
Yeah. Yeah, and proximity. And I know we're at time, but I think that's a great place to end, is that what we want to do is take this big gap people think exists between them and the practice of the death penalty and close it.
Yeah.
Actually, this practice is being done on your behalf and in our name. And in Oklahoma, the manner of death on the death certificate is homicide. And it says, "We the people of Oklahoma." And if you don't want to be a part of that, or you have questions about that, then here's a place for you to come. Welcome.
Yeah.
You're against the death penalty.
Yeah. There's two things before we end that I want to make sure to point people to. One is next month's conversation. So in the movement, we do this each month. And so next month, October 23rd, we're talking with a group in rural Wilkes County, North Carolina. There's a group there called the Wilkes Recovery Revolution, and they're a nonprofit org that do recovery and addiction work, recovery from addiction work with individuals there. And it's incredible and it's unique, the programs that they have. It's very on the ground work of what does it look like to walk with someone coming out of jail or prison, recovering from addiction. They've got lots of ways that they do that. And so much, Adam, of what we'll talk about in that conversation of their keys to success, it's proximity. Second thing that I want to point people to is October 10th is World Day Against the Death Penalty, and you will hear a lot about a lot of events that will be happening all across the country. One is a national Christian prayer call on the death penalty that will be that evening, Thursday, October 10th. You can register for that. And it will be a space to really consider some of these things. We'll talk through some of these facts, data, these stories. We'll pray through those things. We'll hear from an individual who's a death row exoneree, and it's meant to be a hospitable place for someone to come in to think about and pray through the death penalty, but particularly on that day of World Day Against the Death Penalty. So there's all sorts of ways that people can engage, and we often use the language of wanting people to move from awareness into action, always moving into that place of what does it look like to love my neighbor in an active way. So Adam, I'm so grateful for a lot of things. You being here, for all of this work. I mean, you shared so much of your story in the past, but so much of this is continuing to develop, of you continuing to give a lot of your time and efforts to this. So thank you for that. And also just for being here and talking through a lot of these things that are layered and hard.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for inviting me to come share. I'm grateful to be here with you all.
Yeah, absolutely. Friends, thanks for joining us. Again, we'll send out all these resources as well as the recording, and blessings on your day. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.